Welcome to the EFC webinar. I'm Karen Stiller from Faith Today magazine. Renegotiating Faith, the delay in young adult identity formation and what it means for the church in Canada is the new report that examines how we can help young adults after high school continue on in their faith and within faith communities. The study is a partnership between Power to Change students, InterVarsity, Youth for Christ, Truth Matters, and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Today we have Rick Hiemstra, lead researcher from the EFC, Anton Lim from Power to Change, and Jeremy McDonald from Truth Matters. We'd like to welcome you to send in your questions anytime using the chat function on your screen. We want to hear from you, and we want to help unpack the research with you, so please do that. And send them in anytime during the webinar. So before we really dig in, I'd like to ask our guests to introduce themselves a little more fully and share what was for them the most exciting finding of the research. So Jeremy, let's start with you, and welcome to everybody.
Excellent. Yeah, great to be here. And so my name is Jeremy McDonald. I've been working as a part of church ministry for about a decade and primarily working with students over the years. These days, I work at a church in Ontario called Connexus with locations in Midland, Barrie, and Orillia. And then also getting a chance to do some cool stuff with Truth Matters, a part of this project as well. So I've been amazed reading through Renegotiating Faith and doing some deep dives into it. In particular, the power of connection between our different organizations, whether it be camps, campus ministries, churches, all of those things, when they work well together, the opportunity is just immense for helping students continue on with their faith after high school.
That's great. Thank you. Anton, how about you? Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I think the fact that it's Canadian research has always been very exciting for me. There's coming from a student ministry that works with college and university students. I think for a long time among my colleagues, we've known a lot of these realities, but to be able to put Canadian numerical numbers on some of this information is exciting for me. Something like recognizing that students going on to post-secondary are 4 times more likely to connect with Christian community if they have someone from their home church who's connecting, helping them in that transition and connecting them. Or noticing that 75% of students connect with Christian community in the first month of post-secondary, in that first month of September. And so it's just nice to know, okay, there's actual factual data to support what we've kind of known anecdotally.
Yeah, thank you. And Rick, how about you?
My name is Rick Hiemstra. I'm the lead researcher in this project. I study the church in Canada, so my role here at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada is the director of research. Sort of what really excites me about this particular research is that we have some really practical things that we can offer churches. And I think that a lot of people, when they look at youth ministry and youth leaving the church, they sort of feel helpless, like they don't understand what's going on or what they might do about it. And I think, with this report, we can both help people to understand and we can give them some practical ideas about what to do about it.
Great, thank you. So just a reminder again, send in your questions at any time. So you've touched on a few things. The report is available for downloading for free at renegotiatingfaith.ca. But if somebody was not going to read the entire 184 pages, as well written as it is, what do they need to know about what you discovered? Rick, why don't you take that first?
So the first thing that you need to understand is that life has changed for young adults. In the last few decades, the capacity to become an adult, to grow up, has shifted. So there are things that are preventing them from making this transition to adulthood, like difficulty finding full-time work. And so part of the capacity to become an adult is simply things like being able to move out, get your own place, to afford that, to enter full-time work, to have the capacity to do something like getting married. And so part of all of this goes along with identity formation, and identity is formed when people gain the capacity to make adult commitments, and some of that capacity is just missing for them now. And if you think that in this way, that adulthood now is delayed by about 5 to 7 years, that's about 1/5 of people's adult lives that are gone. And that's a big change in how things work. And the really important thing for us as Christians is that part of adult identity formation is making commitments and forming a Christian adult identity. And so that's delayed. And this is something that we have to understand, and that they're going to need a Christian community at the point where they're forming that adult identity.
Okay, and that adult identity is formed after they leave high school, you're saying, and that's why the Christian community is so important to be present in their lives then.
More and more. So
okay.
people go through their developmental stages at different rates, but the new reality for most young adults now is that they're entering a period that we call emerging adulthood. And in that period, their identity has not been formed, and their persistent faith commitments are being delayed.
Okay. And Jeremy, I think you mentioned this, and Anton as well, about the relationships between the different faith communities that can exist in the life of a young person. So, Jeremy, for you, can you sort of summarize for people how important that relationship is between the groups, and what are the groups?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the important thing about this relationship between groups comes down to the opportunity that we have at each stage, whether we're working with students and young adults in a camp setting or in a church setting, maybe community youth workers, or you're on a university campus, that in any of these arenas, we have an opportunity to really mentor students. And, mentorship came up in a really big way throughout this research. And so if we're able to talk to one another and to transfer trust as a student moves from, a camp throughout the summer where they're being built into in a really powerful way, their faith is being stretched, they're experiencing, a small opportunity to renegotiate their own faith role in a new kind of community, that to bridge that back to their local church and to allow that work to continue kind of seamlessly. Man, there's a lot of power and synergy to that. So finding ways to connect those dots, I think, is going to be one of the big takeaways from this research.
Okay, and Anton, you are actively involved in campus ministry. Tell us what you're doing with Power to Change to sort of bridge that gap, what other people could learn from what you're experiencing.
Yeah, I think we just want to, first of all, we just want to increase the conversation about the need for these connections, these next Christian communities that Rick talked about in his report, and the value of that. And I think it's establishing partnerships with different organizations, different relational connections with youth pastors from across Canada. And something that Rick had said in his report about youth ministry is that often there is a conclusion to youth ministry for a student. They kind of graduate out, and if they're part of, especially if they're a part of a small church that doesn't necessarily have a strong young adult ministry, they kind of age out, and especially if they move out to university, travel away, the absence of all that community that they're familiar with is gone. And so I think we want to work with churches, organizations that work with youth to provide their graduates access to a Christian community, whether it be an organization like Power to Change, or another student ministry like InterVarsity. There's many other types of communities that students can access on campus and locally.
I think I'll just jump in here and say, why community is just so important. As Christians, we have our own reasons for valuing the church and other Christian communities. But, the framework for this research was the framework of a psychologist called Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson said that identity is formed when you negotiate a role in a community. And what that really means is that we're not going to know who we are apart from the communities that we're actually committed to serve in and identify with. And so this becomes really important. And what it means is that when you start forming your Christian identity, if you don't have a Christian community to form that identity with, you're very unlikely to actually go and do that. Especially as evangelicals, we have this idea that it could just be Jesus and me, and we'll form a relationship and we'll get along just fine. But I think both our pastoral experience and what Erikson is saying suggests that if you're really going to negotiate those roles, if you're really going to grow in your faith, that you need Christian community. And what we have to do is be intentional about thinking about what Christian communities are actually present in young adults' lives at all stages, And, like Anton was alluding to, sometimes we kick them out of Christian communities, like when they age out of youth group at the end of high school. And are we thinking about what next Christian communities are sort of available to them, and how do they get into them?
Okay, so Anton, how do we practically do that? If my son is graduating from high school and he's going, pardon me, to a different city for university, what should our youth pastor be doing for my son?
Yeah, I think taking the proactive approach, say for a youth pastor, kind of getting ahead of the curve instead of waiting till September when they're out of sight, kind of out of mind, and they've graduated, so they're not kind of in your they're not in your view. And so thinking through making a plan, I think that was actually one thing that was found in the research is that I think only 3 in 10 ministry workers, only 30% of ministry workers actually had a plan of figuring out, okay, what should I actually do for my grade 12 students? So I think it's getting ahead of the curve, keeping in mind these grade 12 students are going through a journey. They're applying for university and then they're visiting campuses. And so even for a youth pastor to come alongside them during that grade 12 year and encourage them to go find a Christian group when they make a campus visit, or helping a student and pointing them online to a student organization, or helping them to find local churches. Doing that all before September is, I think, is important, is critical, because September, it's so overwhelming for students, and so we need to get ahead and really serve the students.
Yeah. So, Jeremy, you work in youth ministry in a church context. Is this feasible? Is this realistic for busy youth pastors to add this on?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to phrase the question. Is it an add-on? Or I think I would challenge us as church youth workers to think about our role as maybe different than we typically have. Oftentimes we see our role as being, hey, can we help these kids make moral choices while they're students? Like, we're looking at behavior modification. Can we just keep them out of trouble? Then their parents will be happy. Sometimes we mark our success in ministry based off of attendance at events. Hey, how many kids can we, gather around our church on a week-to-week basis? And, those are interesting conversations to have. But what I think this research is helping us to recognize is, if we're really serious about instilling the kind of faith that's going to last well beyond high school with our students and allow them to kind of dive deep with Jesus over their entire life, then we have to think about our success markers as a little bit different. And I love Anton's suggestions, because I think that can kind of lead us into this place of thinking creatively. Okay, what could we do to help our students' faith thrive beyond high school? How could we set up a systematic way of connecting them with churches where they might be going? How can we talk about Christian communities so that they recognize it's valuable even after they leave this place? And if we start to talk about those things, I think we can get to like nitty-gritty details. So for us, we're trying to figure out for our grade 12 small group leaders, our mentors that are with grade 12s, what if we just ask those leaders to stick on for an extra 4 months or 6 months as a small group leader for that same group of students, and spend that summer and that first fall continuing to track with their students? They already have a relationship with them. Maybe they still come into the church on a weekly basis, but spend consistent time week in and week out helping those students to renegotiate their role in the new community, in their new phase of life post high school.
Okay,
Can I just comment here, just to elaborate a little bit more? With Power to Change, what we're hoping to do as we interact, as we work with different organizations, churches, camps, our hope is actually connect with, we want to serve by relationally connecting with many of these grade 12 students in their grade 12 year. And we invite those students to actually, if they're interested, to connect with Christian community. We invite them to leave their information with us. And for those students, even right now, I know there's students that are applying for university here in Ontario. They haven't even had acceptances, but we try to track with these grade 12 students so that in March or by June, once they've actually received their acceptances, made some decisions, we try to actually connect the dots. And so if I say, for example, your son, if I had his information and he was heading off to the University of Ottawa, I would be in touch with some of our staff and our student leaders at the University of Ottawa, and they would actually personally reach out to your son well before September, hopefully sometime in August, being that first person to welcome your son into the next stage of life.
I think some of what we found is sort of basic human nature. We all know what it's like to try to break into a new church or a new group. And, if you ask anybody, not just young adults, why didn't you go to that church? What they'll often say is, I didn't know anybody there.
Mm.
And so one of the big challenges for us is to make sure that young adults know somebody in those next Christian communities where they're going, whether that's another church or a Christian campus group. And that, there's just really practical things, like if say, for instance, your child is going to U of T, do you get in the car with them and drive to U of T and set up a lunch with, say, a Christian campus worker who you've made a connection with previously, and you just have lunch with them and let them to get to know the campus worker or someone there? Because then when they go to the campus and they can connect with the Christian campus group and they know somebody. And just knowing that first person is often just this huge barrier to actually getting involved.
I'd like to say that I think I have terrible children because they would not want that to happen. So personality must, I'm joking, of course, but personality must play into this a little bit with what works with that youth person.
Yeah, and if I can speak to that too, I think that's part of the power and the value of having a mentor that's tracking with students into that season. Because it might be way outside of their personality, and yet if they have this person that's in their corner, that's they've got a high amount of trust built in already, and that mentor is encouraging them or thinking through, okay, maybe they're not going to feel comfortable like just waltzing on their own. So maybe I drive down with them, or maybe I get somebody else to reach out to them, or maybe I have to find a new creative way because I know the person. So it's and Rick said it's relational. It's less about finding like the perfect silver bullet system and more about how can we connect our students to more and more people that authentically actually care about them and care about their faith development over the long haul.
And of course, mentors aren't parents, which is important. So Rick, say what you're going to say, and then let's talk more about mentors and the role they play.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sort of a biblical example. You've got Moses mentoring Joshua, right? You've got Elisha mentoring, or Elijah mentoring Elisha, and they sort of, with Elijah and Elisha, right? Elijah gives his mantle to the people, and it's sort of a sign. He gives his authority within the community to the people. And in many ways, mentors kind of do that, reintroducing people to the community, and they help them make those next connections.
Okay, so let's dig more into mentoring, guys. Anton, what's your perception of maybe what needs to change with how we mentor our kids right now?
Yeah, thinking about parents, I think keeping that mentorship component in mind and not necessarily feeling the onus is all on them to invest in their students. And so maybe they're part of a church and there is like a small group type of model for their youth. That's great to pursue, but sometimes some churches don't have that. And I know that I think you can make this kind of think through who are some of those people in our lives right now, maybe in the church, maybe outside of the church, that love Jesus, that we want to encourage our students to connect with, and how do we create those opportunities? So it's not just like drive them to that church that they're going to go to in the future, but how do we get those additional voices into the student's life? And so forging that, I don't know how to necessarily create those relationships.
Yeah, Jeremy, what would you add to the whole mentoring question?
Yeah, I think I would put one quick caveat, just and Rick can speak to this. Like Christian parents who are really carefully trying to follow Jesus and exhibiting signs of that, whether it be regular prayer or their own personal devotion life. I think we've seen in our Canadian research that makes a huge difference for the life of a student's faith over the long haul. Is that right, Rick?
It does.
So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it does, especially where there's a warm relationship between the parent and child, right? You can't have sort of a cold, harsh, authoritarian relationship with your child and then expect that they'll see your Bible reading and your prayer and catch the faith. That doesn't work.
Yeah, that's helpful, and that hopefully will be encouraging, obviously, to parents as well, that that their influence is massive, and then to couple that with this idea of mentors, the way that that I would do it with our churches, and that I'd recommend if people are trying to figure out how to implement this, is just to make the main part of your program with students to be a small group kind of setting, or to be an opportunity for students to gather together and to have a consistent mentor in their life. And so rather than focus on the main programming for students being about just an upfront communicator and the big party and the fun games, to make sure that at that, wherever there's the most amount of students that gather, use that environment as a place to then take some time with students, connecting for maybe it's 30 minutes with the same mentor and a small group of students as often as you meet, whether it be every week or every other week. And then that will elevate that importance for having mentors a part of students' lives.
Yeah. I think part of the problem with our conversation about mentors is that we all mean different things when we talk about mentors. And the students, when we interviewed them, they were looking for things like help understanding themselves, sort of emotional support. Some will be looking for sort of career counseling. But what we found is almost half of the students said that they had a home church mentor of some kind when they were growing up. So they think it's going on. We know that the people that said that they had a home church mentor had different kind of spiritual outcomes. And, the other thing that we know about mentoring is that a lot of adults are just terrified by the idea that they might be a mentor. And so one of the things that we tried to break down in our research is just some really simple things that mentors are, right? They're not Iron Man. They're not a superhero, right? They're ordinary people living out sort of consistent Christian lives in front of the people. And I say that they do sort of four things, right? First, they call out what God's put inside. And so, young adults are always struggling to recognize where they're going to be able to successfully negotiate a role. And it's not just information to sort of call out the talent that you see that God's placed inside. What you're doing is you're opening up a way for them to negotiate a role with that talent. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that they are reintroducers. And if they're going to join what I call the Society of Adults in our churches, they're going to have to be reintroduced in a way that reframes how the churches think of them, right? You can't be 19 years old and have an 11-year-old role in the church. You're just going to leave, because that's just not tolerable. And the third thing is that mentors are negotiation advisors. And what I mean by this is that, sometimes life in church is rough and you need somebody to help you kind of understand and process what happened. And that's important. And then the fourth thing is that your continuity, and Anton and Jeremy have both talked about this, right? So much of young adults' lives today is just discontinuous, one program thing that stops after another, people that move out of their lives. And you just cannot overemphasize the importance of having somebody who is a wise Christian who cares about them, that's consistently a part of their lives.
I would say that a bit of great news coming out of this is that this idea of mentoring is available to churches of all sizes, because there's always a church that has a better youth program than your church, and more like fun, crazy things going on. So, but mentoring, I'm gathering, can happen in very, very small churches to very large ones, right?
Oh, for sure. And that is the good news. And what our report talks about is the difference that these mentoring relationships can make. In terms of persistence, as Anton was saying, having a mentor or not having a mentor, or makes this huge difference in whether they connect with a Christian campus group or they connect with a next church. And this is something that's within the capacity of all churches to do. It's just sometimes we think that we have nothing to offer them, or we're intimidated by their level of education. And yet we have all this wisdom from lived lives, and they need that.
Yeah. Now, we've been using the word students a lot. Some kids, of course, graduate from high school and don't go off to college or university, and maybe they're taking a year off. So I know the report touches on gap year information as well. Anton, do you want to tackle gap year?
Yeah, I think those students that do take a year off specifically with the intent to perhaps do a one-year Bible college program, or to join in another type of organization just for 1 year. I think what they experience is that they get to experience community, but in a community that's independent of their previous community. And so even in that 1 year, they get to experience what it's like to kind of carve out that role. What's my role with regards to the Christian faith, with regards to kind of the church? And I've always been excited when students do take gap years because I think they get what I call they get their first year frills out. You know, they get to experience the independence, but in the context of a Christian community. And then if they do decide to go on to post-secondary after, well, like they're all the excitement of that, all the novelty of living life independently has already kind of been experienced, and they get to really focus in on the academics of going to university, and or they can connect further with Christian community. So I think yeah, gap year opportunities offered by organizations and Bible colleges are definitely something worth pursuing for a student, or to encourage students to consider.
We have a question from a viewer I'd like you to tackle. This person is wondering about the delay in marriage and family formation. How can we help young adults to have a healthier attitude to relationships and marriage? So I guess cutting into that delay. It's interesting because I know quite a few young Christian couples who are getting married earlier. So that's just anecdotal, but I don't know if that's changing or not. Rick, why don't you take that first?
Sure. So what Erickson would say is that until you have formed an identity, he would say that stage 5 is identity formation in his 8-stage theory of psychosocial development. Stage 6 is the ability to actually give yourself to someone else. And so this identity formation piece comes first. And, you know, we do things in our culture where we tell our kids, you know, until you go through school, don't get married. And in part, many of them are in stages where they're just not ready to get married. But I think that we can actually end up discouraging marriage, because marriage is a commitment, right? And what we have to realize is that until they form an identity, they really don't have the capacity to make those commitments. And some of the forming that identity is having the capacity to make commitments to things like jobs, to things like your own place, to things like family. And we have to realize that the structure of our society has actually disabled them, if you will, from getting to the place where they can make those kinds of commitments. And we see this not just in Canada, but in other parts of the world. If I go to get married and then I have to move in with my parents to afford to live, you know, you just don't want to be in that situation. And so you delay that part of being an adult. And we have to think about our, you know, our economics, and this is a place where economics sort of affects spiritual development and family development.
Rick, didn't we also see in the research that not only does it seem like marriage might be on the decline, but also cohabitation has been affected?
Yeah, and so you know, on the assumption that cohabitation is another kind of commitment, yeah, it's not just that people aren't getting married as much anymore, but the rate at which they cohabitate is going down as well. So they're not forming those relationships together where they take responsibility for each other and share lives together. That doesn't mean that they're not sexually active. They are, but if they're sexually active without any sort of responsibility.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, this is something that was kind of captured in the research. Rick identified 3 fears: FOMO, fear of missing out; FNBA, fear of not being amazing; and FOPM, fear of passionless monotony. And I don't know for sure, but I wonder how those fears influence a student or a young adult from making those commitment choices. You know, oh, if I commit to this one person, then does that mean does that determine my rest of the future? I might be missing out on the perfect person. The fear of not being amazing. Well, if I commit to this one person, maybe it's restrictive to my career paths or my future dreams. You know, I might not accomplish my most amazing career because of these relational commitments. And I think we have to increase kind of the dialogue about how to address those fears, and is there substance to those fears, and what does the gospel say to fear, and what does it mean to trust God in light of these potential fears that we might have.
And as churches were selecting or recruiting mentors, could they also, pardon me, try to find a wide, variety of mentors? So a mentor who is single in a healthy way, and a married couple mentor who are the same, and bring those people into the kids' lives.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely brilliant. And there's so many things that come up in the life of students that are difficult to maybe necessarily systematically approach and tackle. Obviously, in church world, we want to talk about marriage and relationships and how that should be healthy, how that can be God honoring. But how can we help young adults to have a healthier attitude to relationships and marriage? I think it's introduce them or make sure that they know some people that have good relationships in marriage. Not that they're picture perfect, but that they can see what it is really like to be in that kind of healthy, committed relationship. And if it's modeled well for them, I think that gives them opportunity when the time comes to circle back and ask those kinds of questions. It may not be that if their mentor, is married, they may not have the questions, when they're a grade 9 guy about what that marriage relationship really looks like. But you might be surprised that 8 years later, when they're getting serious with their girlfriend, they might look that number up again and give that guy a call and say, hey, I'm trying to sort this kind of thing through, and I would love your input because you modeled your relationship for us grade 9 guys to see. And that's been, that's anecdotal as well. That's been a little bit of my experience, but I think that's one of the huge wins of mentors is whatever situation arises with students, if you have somebody who is following Jesus and willing to journey alongside of the students, then that in that moment, they'll be able to, if not answer those questions or sort through that stuff, source out who else in the community can I invite to be a part of this student's life around this particular issue.
It's also probably worth commenting in regards to someone who is considering mentoring or is scared of mentoring. I think you have to recognize mentoring doesn't lock you in forever. I think we might think the idea of mentor is indefinite, but I think we need to see it as for my season of life, how can I be part of another student's season of life to maybe just help them move to the next season? And maybe God says that will only be the time that you spend, but maybe there will be someone else that you pass that on to, that responsibility and opportunity to. It's just like Jeremy was saying.
I really think confidence is an issue. Like in our church, we've had young couples share with us that they want to spend time with older couples, for example, speaking of couple language, but they feel like the older couples don't really get it, or, they're sort of like, why would you want to have dinner with us? But when we do it, when my husband and I do it, we can see that it's such a healthy, wonderful thing and a joy for us as well. So maybe we just need to also talk up mentoring a lot more in our churches. I'd love to switch to camp talk for a minute because we haven't really talked about camp. So how do we connect the dots between camp and youth group the rest of the church year and then campus ministry? I don't know who wants to take that one. Anton, maybe you can start.
I would say the only thing that I can comment on, being a student ministry, we know that there are either campers or even some staff workers at camps that have been invested in for not just that one summer, but for many summers. And so we want to, I've already had conversations with some camp directors to figure out how do we better increase that dialogue and connection for their staff that are college and university bound. And so I know that's just having kind of healthy conversations of what that looks like. Sometimes it's speaking to the students. Sometimes it's just resourcing the students. So that's about all I can say in terms of what it looks like from a camp to student university ministry.
Rick, could you tell us about, like, we saw a pretty big jump, when students are a part of camp, like their faith, the chances that it continues on, it goes sky high. Do you know why that is?
Well, certainly there's a correlation between, faith persistence in camp. And I think some of it's like this. You go to camp and you have these great experiences. One, you're connecting into a community, you're negotiating your own rules, you get leadership experience. And, when we did our interviews, we had some people that would talk about these kinds of experiences, and then they would go back to their church, and their church has no knowledge that they have these giftings or they have this leadership ability, and then they wouldn't give them the opportunity to sort of continue on using those gifts and talents. Again, this is part of this reintroducing idea for them. And so camps, I think, they do a really great job, but they have this responsibility to, do that reintroducing piece with the local church. How do you report back to the local church about all the great things that this young man or young woman has been doing in this camp context, so that the church gives them a chance to continue on? Otherwise, we have this great sort of mountaintop experience at camp, and then they go back to church, and church just shuts them down. And we want sort of more of a consistent sort of Christian experience, but that becomes really important. I don't know, even just for campers, do you write letters home and say, we just saw God do these amazing things in the life of these campers, and I think that you could really use this person in your church in this way, or to talk to their parents or their pastors or whatever about how you saw the leadership abilities of an LIT at camp just come alive. And again, I can't stress enough that it's not just that's information. That's information that somebody noticed, and now I'm being given the opportunity. And we have to make sure that the opportunities that they have at camp are transferable to other areas of Christian life.
I love that. As a camp parent, our camp has been so important to our kids' lives. They would say that it has, really been the thing that has kept them as believers, basically. But to have that missing link filled between camp and church would really be incredible. So, Jeremy, do you have any other practical things to add there?
Yeah, well, just practical on the church side of things. So, man, I'd be super grateful for like that kind of report card back on our students. That would be great. But from our perspective, I think as church workers, we have to clear the way for our students and our kids to end up at camps. And so just in response to this research, we just have sparked some conversations where we have called a camp director and said, hey, what do you want to do if you had open free reign to get all of our students? Like we want all of our students to end up at camp. What's the best way to do that? Do we need to give them pamphlets? Do we need to have like an information session? Do we need to tell their mentors, their small group leaders to encourage them to go? And just asking that question has been helpful. It kind of reveals some new ideas. But the idea for us has been, we'll do whatever it takes to get students there because we know the difference that it's going to make in their life.
Yeah. So really, like, communication is a huge issue here, a huge piece of this puzzle, the communication between the groups.
Yeah, it's that networking piece, right?
Yeah.
And I think that increasingly, as ministry workers, we have to look at networking as part of our jobs, because we can't network kids unless we're first networked.
Right. And shouldn't this be easier than ever to do, given our online world?
I think that the best riches relationships are the kind that are in person and where people learn to trust each other and gain that sort of relational confidence that allows them to make the recommendations, to pick up the phone, to talk, to text, whatever. But relationships get grounded in face-to-face relationships.
And we are talking, I think, I don't know if these groups were ever in competition with each other because they're kind of at different age times in our kids' lives, but there is really a spirit of working together here that is hugely important and feels kind of new. Is that your take, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think there is maybe as youth workers, and maybe this isn't as felt as much if you're a part-time youth worker and you've got your full-time job and you're just trying to pull this thing together. But if this has been your career, there's a sense of, I guess there's a dangerous pull that you want to build your own kingdom and be the one that students look to for advice and spiritual direction, and that everybody thinks you are the person that knows it all. What we're trying to say is that actually, if you actually really do care about the faith of your students, then you want to push that down and have them look at their mentors, other people that are in their life, for them to experience great things at camp. And so you're not programming big stuff in your youth ministry through the summer because you want to leverage the opportunities that are at camp. And it can be a bit of a humble step if you've been using your youth ministry to kind of build up your own platform and ego. But I think, our students' faith is worth it. I think it's worth taking the risk to invite other people to be the heroes and to be the ones that will actually help these students renegotiate faith roles in new kinds of ways.
Yeah. Anton, how do you view that? It feels like a new chapter from what you guys are saying about working together. So for you, from the campus perspective, what does that do for you?
Yeah, it's exciting. It's thrilling to see, at least in our experience with our organization, with Power to Change, working together with other organizations and recognizing every organizations have different strengths and that can bring to the table that you can bring to the table to help with students and student ministry. And so even this research partnership, I think, is a demonstration and a reflection of the power of collaboration and working together. I know that the chair of our partnership team, Sid Coop, was always saying at the very front beginning, let's have low ego and high trust. Let's all recognize that we are all doing kingdom work and we are all working together for similar purposes. So it's, yeah, just thrilling to see and lead. I think lead the charge in making these things happen.
If I can just also say, though, especially for church youth workers, people that are in that zone, uh, just knowing this information isn't going to be enough to always enact change in your local context. Just because you see the value of networking and allowing other ministry programs to kind of rise up and influence your students, there's a great chance that the board that has hired you or your senior leader that you report to may not have caught on to all of these kinds of things. And so I think one of our responsibilities, if you're listening to this, is to do a little bit more digging so that you feel comfortable teaching and allowing what we're discovering through this research to kind of spread beyond just your own team of people who care about student ministry and the people that are above you who are actually decision makers, because that pressure to have the big program and to have all the students come, that will continue unless you're able to help change the minds of some of those folks.
Yeah. And so much of what we're talking about assumes a willingness on the part of the young person to even participate. And a viewer has asked, how do you advise a parent whose children are moving away from faith when they won't actually go to camp or youth group, I guess, or a campus ministry once they leave? Is that when we just pray hard? Jeremy, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so I've had that conversation with a lot of parents over the years, and it's brutal. And as a parent myself of young kids, man, I'm praying hard for my kids, and yet in that moment, I think alongside of prayer, there is an opportunity to invite not necessarily the programmatic parts to this whole thing, like, hey, why don't you go to camp, or can you not go to this campus ministry, or let me introduce you to this church, and go back to the relationships that are strongest within the church. And so if there's someone else that can come alongside of you who cares about this student, you're talking to a parent, who does this kid look up to? Who do you think that they would be open to a conversation with? And then prime that volunteer, that person, just with a little bit of encouragement. Hey, would you reach out to this student and invite them forward, whether it be coffee or have a burger or have a phone call, and make sure that it's not like a bait and switch thing. Like, I'm getting you to have Tim Hortons with me so that I can wham you with, you should go to camp, but instead that it's an actual caring for who this kid is and where they're going with their faith journey, and let that relationship to continue to grow. That's kind of where we landed. And if you've got in your church an established mentorship or small group leaders, or that's part of your program, then you've got people built in already who care about it, who understand it, and who might be willing to take that step for you.
So churches really need to get their mentoring act going. In our last couple of minutes, Rick, let's start with you. If you can respond to that if you want, and then let's wrap up with one last encouraging thought or action that can come out of this report for people. So go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I'll just address the question for a minute. We've talked about how important parents are in the lives of kids, and they are. But then kids, especially in their teenage years and on, they get to a place where they want to differentiate themselves from their parents. And this is where having a good church community is just as important as having good parents. And we have to realize that we have to be about nurturing the church community as well, because that's what's going to nurture our kids when the time comes that you're just not the person in this season of life to have the same kind of input. You'll still have input all the way along, but this is where the mentors are there. And so we have to be concerned about the general health of our churches and communities. in terms of a wrap-up thing, I just want to encourage us that, some of what we're experiencing now, where we're having challenges keeping our kids in our church, this is about sort of these macro changes that have delayed adulthood. It has delayed their identity formation. And, knowing that, now we can figure out kind of what we can do. And it sort of takes away the sense that, kids just aren't interested in church. Well, no, they are interested in church, but their lives have been radically transformed by an economy that won't let them participate until they're in their late 20s. It's been radically transformed by things like social media, and we could spend a lot of time talking about that. We haven't here today, but it has changed the way that they interact with communities. And as we start to understand that, there are things that we can do. I'm convinced that the gospel is it was winsome for this generation as it's been for any generation. And what we have to do is understand how they're hearing the gospel. And then I think that there are very practical things that the smallest to the biggest church can do.
Thank you, Rick. How about you, Anton?
With regards to your earlier question about parents, I do often think about the story of the prodigal son, and when talking to some parents, I do say, like, just if they have already if you think as it appears to you, they've disengaged in faith, I think there can be some practical things you can do, but in addition to praying, I think we just have to keep nurturing that relationship, because the son comes home. At some point, the son comes home, and it's because the son knows that they have a father, they have parents waiting. And I think if we're continuing to foster and develop those relationships with our children, they'll come home. At least they're going to come home and at least talk to us. Maybe their engagement in faith isn't going to look exactly the way you planned it, but they're going to have you in their corner for the rest of their life. And so we want to keep nurturing that relationship even after they're in high school, or even after they've graduated college and university. In regards to maybe just some closing thoughts, I just think we just have to keep helping our students understand, what does the gospel look like in my life now, but what does it look like in maybe the next stage of life? For a high school student, they might not be necessarily thinking, what does the gospel look like when I'm married and 40? Their next stage of life might be college, might be university, might just be in the workplace. So how do we help students think through how the gospel intersects with all facets of their life, and how does faith intersect all their life? And we need to think about just the next stage to help them in that context.
Thank you. Jeremy, any last words?
Yeah, I think it's just this question that rattles around in my brain. What is the faith of the next generation worth? And I really think it's worth everything. I think it's worth reading the research. I think it's worth processing it with your team. I think it's worth doing whatever kind of programmatic changes you need to, so that we can see more students following Jesus through and because of the ministry that he's called us to in our communities. And so I'm just optimistic. I'm excited about what's happening in the church in Canada, and how this is going to help fuel us to continue to be just helpful hands and feet of Jesus, he's called us to minister to people. So it's exciting days.
That's great. Well, hey guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm personally feeling really encouraged, and I hope you are too if you watched this webinar and participated. We are going to post it online. You can find it very shortly at the efc.ca/webinars. Share it around, please. Help it, use it to create discussion in your own church and communities. You can download the Renegotiating Faith report at no cost at renegotiatingfaith.ca, and you can find out about upcoming webinars at the efc.ca/webinars. So thank you so much.